Okay, you talked there about sector and cluster. Are they the same thing?
Yes, that's a question that is often asked. Is a sector the same as a cluster? When we talk about the cluster approach, we're really talking about a partnership approach. We're trying to ensure that in each of the sectors, we respond not simply on the basis of individual agencies, but having more of a task force approach or a partnership approach, a group approach, what we call the cluster approach, so that for each sector, you have a group of organizations that works together to address needs in that particular area. That's what the cluster approach is all about. And it's about improving the capacity of these agencies to respond adequately in each of these sectors. I mentioned earlier that in the past, sectors such as water and sanitation, there was no clear lead agency at the global level. And often at the country level, there was no clear lead agency. We're trying to ensure now that with newly designated global leads in all areas, those agencies are responding for building up the global capacities, for doing the necessary standard setting, for ensuring that you have clear policies for all these sectors, that you have adequate stockpiles and rosters of staff who can be deployed in new emergencies. At the country level, we're also trying to ensure that by having designated agencies who are responsible for leading the response in each of these sectors in support of the government, that we'll have a much more predictable and efficient system of humanitarian response.
And what will be the benefits of this cluster approach?
Ultimately, we want to ensure a much more strategic response in emergencies. In the past, the response was often based on who gets there first. It was often simply a scramble for territory. And we saw a lot of competition, rivalry amongst agencies, and we also saw a lot of bickering and duplication. And frankly, in the past, what we've often seen is very amateurish and ad hoc responses to emergencies. We want to ensure that in the future, we will have a much more predictable system, better accountability. You know who to turn to in each sector. You know who to call on when there's a gap that is not being addressed. The emergency relief coordinator at the global level knows who to call on if there are particular problems in a particular sector. Governments know who to turn to, who's going to be their main counterpart in a particular sector. In the past, it was often the case that hundreds of international organizations would arrive in a particular country, loads of different acronyms, you didn't know who was doing what, and even we ourselves don't know all these different organizations and these confusing acronyms. It was very difficult for governments to understand who these different organizations are. We're trying to make the lives of donors, of governments, of the people that we're there to help much easier by having a better structured humanitarian response.
Now, some people say this is just about the UN trying to get everyone else to dance to its tune. Is that how you see it?
This is not about the UN sitting on top. This is about us working together with partners in a much more strategic way and working together as equal partners, recognizing the different strengths and weaknesses, the comparative advantages of the different organizations. The UN is often better placed to do the overall leadership, the interface with government, coordination, advocacy, monitoring, these kinds of roles, while our NGO partners or the Red Cross, Red Crescent movement, IOM, some of these other actors are often better placed to be providing the assistance itself, to be doing the direct implementation. There's a lot of capacity out there now, and often we find that NGOs are much quicker, they're often more cost-effective, they're often much better at getting out to the remote areas that are inaccessible. Often the UN has all kinds of security restrictions, that are imposed on us by the system, while NGOs are able to act much more quickly and efficiently. So we need to look at how we can better complement each other. In many cases, the UN, under this new system of the cluster approach, the UN in many of these sectors will take the lead, will be the coordinator for these different sectors, but will work through a strong system of partnership. And as I say, working together as strategic partners, as equal partners, not somehow going back to what we had in the past, where we simply often used NGOs as our subcontractors.
And where do governments fit into all of this?
All of this is about improving the way that we work with governments, improving the way that we work with affected populations, improving the way we work with national civil society, with local NGOs, with international NGOs. It's about improving the whole structure. There's now a lot of actors out there. This is not a question of a humanitarian emergency where you've got 10 or 12 different agencies involved. Often we're talking about hundreds of them. And our role is always to remind governments of their own responsibilities towards their own people, to assist them in providing the necessary assistance where assistance is needed. In many cases, they are not asking for our assistance, or we don't have access in many situations. But we have to distinguish between some of the conflict situations where we often work with governments, we're working with some of the non-government authorities in conflict situations, and distinguish between that and some of the natural disasters, or disasters in general, where you might have a government which is in a very strong position to lead and coordinate the overall response, and they're asking us really to fit into their system and support them, and they're in a strong position to lead the response. For example, in the Pakistan emergency response to the earthquake there a couple of years ago, the Pakistani government had a lot of resources, and its own military was very much engaged and proactively leading the humanitarian response, and we were there to assist them. In some other situations, if it's whether we're talking about Darfur or Eastern Congo or Liberia in the past, or Somalia, countries such as these, we have a different kinds of a relationship with governments. Often they have less capacity, often they are not willing to lead the response. In some cases, they are the obstacle. They are trying to thwart the humanitarian operation, and we have to look at ways to hold them accountable, to remind them of their responsibilities, and to complement them and assist them in whatever way possible. But all of this is about finding a better way to work with governments and with all our different partners.
Is there a risk that this could just end up with bypassing governments completely?
Governments have the primary responsibility for addressing the humanitarian needs of civilians affected by disasters on their own territory. We are not trying to substitute for governments. Governments have that responsibility, and where governments are asking for assistance, we need to support them in providing that assistance. The cluster approach is about us ensuring that we are better structured as an international humanitarian community so that we can provide better support to governments and to the other partners with whom we work.